In the dusty plains of 1870s Wyoming territory, Margaret Whitfield finds herself caught between duty and destiny when her father's gambling debts force him to honor an old agreement. 20 years ago, rancher Thomas Blackwood saved her father's life during an Indian raid, and now he's come to collect on that debt, demanding Margaret's hand in marriage for his son. What neither her father nor Thomas knows is that Margaret once saved that very son, Samuel Blackwood, from drowning when they were children. As Margaret faces an arranged marriage to a stranger who doesn't remember her, she must navigate the harsh realities of frontier life, family loyalty, and the possibility that sometimes fate works in mysterious ways to bring two souls together. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Whitfield homestead as Margaret carefully mended her father's torn workshirt. The fabric was rough beneath her fingers, much like everything else in their corner of Wyoming territory, where survival meant making do with what little you had. At 23, Margaret had grown accustomed to the endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, and tending to their small plot of land, while her father, Henry, spent most of his time at the saloon in nearby Dustwood Creek. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her needlework. Two riders emerged from the heat shimmer on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the golden prairie grass. Margaret shielded her eyes with her hand, squinting to make out their faces. One rider sat tall and commanding on a magnificent black stallion, while the younger man beside him rode a bay mare with the easy grace of someone born in the saddle. As they drew closer, Margaret could see the older man's weathered face marked by years under the harsh Wyoming sun. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his clothes, while dusty from travel, spoke of prosperity, a stark contrast to the patched and faded garments she and her father wore. The younger man appeared to be in his mid-20s with dark hair that caught the sunlight and shoulders broadened by years of ranch work. "Miss Whitfield," the older man called out as they approached the porch, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy. "I'm Thomas Blackwood, and this here's my son Samuel. We've come to speak with your father about an old matter between us." Margaret set aside her mending and stood, smoothing down her simple blue calico dress. The name Blackwood was familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she'd heard it before. "Father's not here at the moment, Mr. Blackwood. He's in town. Perhaps you could call again tomorrow?" Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance with his son before dismounting. "I'm afraid this matter can't wait much longer, miss. Your father and I have an understanding that goes back many years. Perhaps you could tell us when he'll return?" The way Samuel looked at her made Margaret feel strangely unsettled, as if he were trying to remember something just beyond his reach. His eyes, a striking green-gray like storm clouds, seemed to hold a kindness that contradicted his father's stern demeanor. There was something achingly familiar about those eyes, something that tugged at memories she thought she'd forgotten. "He usually returns by supper time," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome to water your horses at the trough." As the men tended to their mounts, Margaret retreated into the small cabin she'd called home for as long as she could remember. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and dining area, with a ladder leading to the tiny loft where she slept. Her father's bedroom was separated by a thin curtain, and the sparse furnishings told the story of their circumstances better than words ever could. She busied herself preparing coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she measured the precious grounds. Something about Thomas Blackwood's presence filled her with dread, though she couldn't say why. The way he'd spoken of an understanding with her father suggested business she knew nothing about, and in her experience, her father's business dealings rarely ended well for anyone but the other party. Through the small window, she watched Samuel as he spoke quietly to his horse, his movements gentle and assured. There was something about the way he carried himself, the careful consideration in his gestures that spoke of a man who'd been taught to value life and treat all living things with respect. It made her wonder what kind of arrangement could exist between their families that would bring them to her door on this particular evening. The sound of another horse approaching made her heart sink. Henry Whitfield rode up to the cabin on his old sorrel gelding, swaying slightly in the saddle. Even from inside, Margaret could tell he'd spent the afternoon drinking away what little money they had. His clothes were disheveled, his hat sat askew on his graying head, and the smell of whiskey seemed to precede him like a warning. "Well, I'll be damned," Henry's voice carried through the thin walls as he spotted the Blackwood men. "Thomas Blackwood, as I live and breathe. Didn't expect to see you in these parts again." Margaret moved closer to the window, watching as her father dismounted with less grace than his visitors. Thomas Blackwood's expression had grown serious, and Samuel stood slightly behind his father, his attention shifting between the two older men and the cabin where Margaret waited. "Henry," Thomas replied with a nod that held no warmth. "I've come to discuss the matter we spoke about 20 years ago. I believe it's time to honor our agreement." The color drained from Henry's face, and Margaret saw him glance nervously toward the cabin. "Now, Thomas, that was a long time ago. Things have changed. Margaret's grown into a fine woman, and she's all I have left since her mother passed. An agreement is an agreement, Henry. You made a promise when I saved your life during that Sioux raid back in '53. You said if you ever had a daughter, she'd marry my son when the time came. Well, Samuel's 25 now, ready to settle down and start a family. I've built a good ranch, and I can provide for a wife properly." Margaret's legs gave out, and she sank onto the rough wooden chair beside the table. The coffee pot sat forgotten on the stove as the full meaning of the conversation outside began to dawn on her. Her father had promised her in marriage to pay a debt she'd never known existed. The arrangement had been made before she was even born. A bargain struck in desperation and sealed with a handshake between two men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Her hand shook as she remembered the stories her father had told her about the Indian raids of the 1850s, how families had banded together for protection, and how some men had made incredible sacrifices to save their neighbors. But she'd never imagined that her own father had been saved at such a cost, or that the price would eventually be her freedom. Outside, the conversation continued in hushed tones, but she could hear the desperation creeping into her father's voice. "She's not ready for marriage, Thomas. She's barely had a chance to live her own life. Surely we can work out some other arrangement?" "The arrangement has already been made, Henry. I've waited long enough for you to honor it. Samuel needs a wife, and your daughter needs a proper home. My ranch can provide security and comfort that you clearly cannot." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to remember everything she could about Samuel Blackwood. The name echoed in her memory, growing stronger with each repetition until suddenly a flood of images came rushing back. A summer day by the creek when she was 8 years old. A boy with dark hair and storm-gray eyes who'd fallen into the rushing water during the spring melt. Her desperate struggle to reach him, to pull him to safety before the current swept him away forever. She remembered now. Samuel Blackwood, the quiet boy from the big ranch east of town who'd come to Dustwood Creek with his father for supplies. He'd been perhaps 10 years old then, gangly and serious with a gentleness that set him apart from the other ranch boys she'd encountered. She'd saved his life that day, though she'd never seen him again afterward. His family had moved their business to other towns, and she'd assumed they'd left the territory entirely. Now, 15 years later, that same boy had returned as a man, not knowing that the woman his father intended him to marry was the same girl who'd once pulled him from the cold creek water. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She'd saved his life as a child, and now he was unknowingly about to save hers by taking her away from the poverty and uncertainty that had defined her existence. But the thought of being bartered away like cattle filled her with a mixture of anger and despair. She'd dreamed of love, of choosing her own path in life, of finding someone who would value her for who she was rather than what she represented. Instead, she was about to become payment for a 20-year-old debt, married to a stranger who probably had no more choice in the matter than she did. The conversation outside had grown more heated, with her father's voice rising in protest and Thomas Blackwood's responses becoming increasingly firm. Samuel remained silent throughout the exchange, and Margaret wondered what he thought about being assigned a bride he'd never met. Did he resent the arrangement as much as she did, or had he simply accepted it as the way things were done in their world? As the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the sunsets she'd watched from this same window throughout her childhood, Margaret realized that her life was about to change forever. Tomorrow she would likely be engaged to Samuel Blackwood, and within days or weeks she would be his wife, living on his family's ranch and leaving behind everything she'd ever known. The thought terrified and excited her in equal measure, because despite the circumstances, despite the anger she felt at being treated like property, she couldn't forget the kindness she'd seen in Samuel's eyes, or the gentle way he'd spoken to his horse. Perhaps, if she was very lucky, the boy she'd saved all those years ago had grown into a man worth saving in return. Like this video if you enjoy thrilling stories from the Old West. Subscribe to the channel for more fascinating stories, and let us know where you're watching this story from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willowbrook as Sarah stood at the window of the small boarding house room her father had secured for the night. Below, early risers were already about their business, the blacksmith stoking his forge, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, and children chasing chickens between the buildings. A milk cow lowed somewhere in the distance, and the familiar sounds of a town awakening should have brought comfort, But Sarah's heart remained heavy with the weight of her impending fate. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching a young woman about her own age emerge from the general store with a basket over her arm. The woman moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged somewhere, someone whose future stretched ahead filled with choices rather than obligations. Sarah envied her that certainty, that freedom to walk down a street without wondering if she would ever see it again. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "Sarah, it's time," came her father's gruff voice, muffled by the thin wooden barrier between them. She turned from the window, smoothing the wrinkles from the simple blue dress she'd worn for traveling. The fabric was worn soft from years of washing, but the color still held true, and the small pearl buttons her mother had sewn on years ago caught the morning light. It wasn't much to look at, certainly nothing like the fine gowns she'd seen in the fashion plates from back east, but it was her best, and she supposed it would have to do for meeting the man who would become her husband by sunset. Her father waited in the narrow hallway, his weathered face showing none of the emotion that surely must be churning within him. After all, he was about to hand over his only daughter to settle a debt incurred long before she was born. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his hat, and Sarah noticed new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "The Blackwood Ranch is about an hour's ride from here," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Samuel's expecting us before noon. His letter said he wanted time to show you around the property before—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would seal her fate. "Before we discuss the terms of my surrender," Sarah said quietly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Robert Caldwell flinched as if she had struck him. "Sarah, I know, Papa." She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I know you wouldn't do this if you saw any other way, but that doesn't make it easier for either of us." They made their way down the creaking stairs of the boarding house, past the landlady who nodded politely but couldn't quite hide her curiosity about their early departure. Sarah wondered what stories would be whispered over coffee cups once they were gone, what speculation would follow in their wake. Small towns thrived on such mysteries, and the arrival and quick departure of strangers always provided fodder for conversation. At the livery stable, their horses waited patiently in the cool shadows. Sarah's mare, Buttercup, nickered softly at her approach, and she took a moment to stroke the animal's neck, drawing what comfort she could from the familiar gesture. The horse had been her companion for years, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday, and the thought of leaving her behind added another layer of loss to an already overwhelming day. "Will I be able to bring her?" she asked suddenly, her voice catching slightly on the words. Her father looked surprised by the question, as if he hadn't considered such practicalities. I don't know. We'll have to ask Samuel. I'm sure he'll understand." But Sarah wasn't sure of anything anymore. Soon, all too soon, they were mounted and riding out of town toward an uncertain future, the familiar streets of Willowbrook falling away behind them, like pages from a book she would never read again. The countryside rolled past in a blur of golden grassland dotted with wildflowers and the occasional grove of cottonwoods. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts, and prairie dogs scurried between their burrows. But Sarah barely noticed the vibrant life surrounding her. Under different circumstances, she might have appreciated the beauty of the landscape, the way the morning mist clung to the hollows, the dance of butterflies among the wild roses, the endless expanse of sky that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. But today it felt like scenery from someone else's life, beautiful, but ultimately meaningless. Her father rode beside her in silence, lost in his own thoughts, and she found herself wondering what memories haunted him about the debt he was so desperate to repay. The war had ended 15 years ago, but its shadows still reached into the present, shaping decisions and destroying lives with the persistence of a wound that refused to heal. "Tell me about this debt," she said finally, her voice cutting through the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the grass. "What exactly did Samuel's father do for you that's worth this?" She gestured to herself, unable to keep the bitterness from her tone. Robert Caldwell's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter and a muscle twitched in his cheek. Then, with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he began to speak. "It was during the war, near the end. I was wounded, bleeding out in a field somewhere in Virginia. Shrapnel from a cannon blast had torn up my leg something fierce, and I was losing blood fast. The battle had moved on, left me behind with the other casualties." His voice grew distant, lost in memories that still had the power to haunt him. "I was ready to give up, ready to just lie there and let it end. Then James Blackwood found me. Sarah listened in silence, watching her father's face as he continued. He was a field surgeon, volunteering his services wherever they were needed. Didn't matter which side you fought for. If you were hurt, he'd patch you up. He found me half dead in that field, spent hours working on my leg, using up his own supplies to save a man he'd never met before. And then, he got me to safety, stayed with me until I was strong enough to travel. Never asked for anything in return, never made me feel like I owed him. But I did owe him. My life, my future, everything that came after. Her father's voice cracked slightly. When the war ended, I promised him that if he ever needed anything at all, I'd make it right. I meant it then, and I mean it now. And now he's called in that debt, Sarah said quietly, understanding flooding through her despite her wish to remain angry. His letter came 3 months ago. Said his boy needed a wife, someone to help him run the ranch and give him sons to carry on the family name. James always was a practical man, but he was good too. Said he'd heard I had a daughter of marriageable age. Wondered if we might come to some arrangement. Her father's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. The boy's apparently been struggling since his father passed last winter. The ranch is successful, but it's too much for one man to handle alone. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She was being traded like livestock, valued only for her ability to work and bear children. The thought made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on the larger picture. If Samuel Blackwood was struggling to manage his inheritance, perhaps there would be opportunities for her to carve out some measure of independence within the confines of their arrangement. Perhaps she could become indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with traditional wifely duties. "What do you know about him?" she asked. "About Samuel, I mean. Is he kind?" Her father considered the question seriously. James spoke of him often in his letters over the years. Said the boy had a gentle heart, good with animals, never raised his hand in anger, lost his mother when he was young, just like you did. Maybe that's given him some understanding of what it means to carry grief. As they crested a low hill, the Blackwood Ranch came into view and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was far more impressive than she had expected. A sprawling complex of buildings dominated by a large 2-story house with a wide wraparound porch. The house itself was painted white with green shutters, and climbing roses wound their way up the support posts, creating a cascade of pink and white blooms that spoke of careful tending. Corrals and paddocks stretched in every direction, filled with prime horseflesh that moved with the easy grace of well-cared-for animals. Whatever struggles Samuel might be facing, they clearly weren't financial. "Impressive," her father murmured, and Sarah heard the relief in his voice. At least she wasn't being married off to a penniless dirt farmer. They rode up the well-maintained drive, past gardens that showed the touch of a woman's hand despite being somewhat overgrown. Hollyhocks and delphiniums stood tall against a white picket fence, while beds of herbs perfumed the air with lavender and sage. Sarah wondered who had planted those roses and whether they had lived to see them bloom. The thought sent another pang of loss through her chest, not just for her own future but for all the unknown sorrows that seemed to cling to this place like morning mist. A figure emerged from the barn as they approached the house, and Sarah's heart began to pound with sudden, inexplicable recognition. Even at a distance, she could see that Samuel Blackwood had grown into an imposing man. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin and the land beneath his feet. As they drew closer, she could make out more details. Dark hair that caught the sunlight, strong hands that guided his horse with gentle expertise, and those same kind eyes she remembered from so long ago. When their gazes met across the yard, something flickered in Samuel's expression, a moment of recognition that was quickly masked by polite courtesy, but not before Sarah caught the flash of surprise that crossed his features. Her heart hammered against her ribs as memory and reality collided with startling force. This was indeed the boy from the river, grown into a man but still carrying that same gentle soul in his eyes. He dismounted and approached them with measured steps, his hat in his hands and his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that transported her instantly back to that summer day 15 years ago. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice deeper than Sarah remembered but carrying the same gentle undertone that had comforted a frightened child by the riverside. "Thank you for making the journey." And Miss Caldwell, his eyes found hers again, and she saw something there that looked almost like wonder mixed with uncertainty. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The formal words hung between them, loaded with unspoken recognition. Sarah managed a small curtsy, her mind racing with questions she couldn't ask. Did he remember her as clearly as she remembered him? Was he thinking of that day by the river, Of a girl in a torn dress who had pulled him from the water? Or was she simply projecting her own memories onto a stranger's face? "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the turmoil in her chest. "Your ranch is quite beautiful." A genuine smile touched his lips at that, transforming his serious features and revealing the boy she had once known. "Thank you. My mother spent years working on those gardens. I'm afraid I haven't quite managed to maintain them the way she did, but I do my best." There was something wistful in his tone, a note of loss that echoed Sarah's own sense of displacement. She always said a home without flowers was just a house. Her father cleared his throat, clearly eager to get the business portion of their visit concluded. The practical matters needed addressing, and Robert Caldwell was not a man comfortable with emotional undercurrents. "Perhaps we could discuss the arrangement. I'm sure you're both anxious to know where things stand." Samuel nodded, though his gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces had suddenly shifted into new configurations. "Of course. Please come inside. I'll have Maria prepare some refreshments and we can talk properly." As they followed him toward the house, Sarah found herself studying the man who was to become her husband. There was something familiar about the way he moved, a certain gentleness in how he held his shoulders that reminded her powerfully of the boy she had pulled from the river. He walked with purpose but without haste, pausing to check on a young colt in a nearby paddock and speaking softly to a barn cat that wound around his legs. The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior, with polished hardwood floors and comfortable furniture that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, formal portraits of stern-faced ancestors mixed with more casual images of ranch life. Sarah's attention was caught by one particular photograph, a woman with kind eyes and Samuel's same gentle smile, standing in the very garden they had just passed through. "Your mother?" she asked softly. Samuel followed her gaze and nodded. "Elizabeth Blackwood. She passed when I was 12. His voice carried old grief, well-worn but never fully healed. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said a woman's touch was what made a house into a home." The comment sent an unexpected pang through Sarah's chest. She was being brought here not as a beloved daughter-in-law but as a solution to a practical problem, a replacement for the feminine presence that had been lost. The reminder stung, even as she recognized the truth in it. A middle-aged Mexican woman appeared in the doorway, her weathered face kind but curious. "This is Maria," Samuel said. "She's been with us since before I was born." "Maria, this is Miss Sarah Caldwell and her father." Maria nodded politely, but Sarah caught the assessing look in the older woman's eyes. No doubt she had opinions about her employer's upcoming marriage, and Sarah wondered what those opinions might be. Did Maria see her as an interloper, or simply as another mouth to feed? "I'll bring coffee," Maria said in accented English, then switched to rapid Spanish as she addressed Samuel. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly questioning, perhaps even concerned. Samuel replied in the same language, his pronunciation suggesting he was as comfortable with Spanish as English. Whatever he said seemed to reassure Maria, because she nodded and disappeared toward what Sarah assumed was the kitchen. "Please sit," Samuel said, gesturing toward a comfortable-looking sofa upholstered in deep blue fabric. "I imagine you have questions about everything." Sarah's father took the lead, settling into an armchair across from the sofa. "Your father's letter outlined the basic arrangement, but there are details that need discussing. The question of dowry, for instance." "I don't want a dowry," Samuel said quietly, and both Sarah and her father looked at him in surprise. "My father saved your life, Mr. Caldwell. The debt was paid long ago, in my opinion. If Miss Caldwell agrees to this marriage, it should be because she chooses to, not because she's being traded to settle an old obligation." Sarah felt her breath catch. This was not what she had expected to hear. Men, in her experience, were practical creatures who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. The idea that Samuel might actually care about her wishes was both thrilling and terrifying. "That's generous of you," her father said slowly, "but a man has his pride. I brought some things that belonged to my late wife. Jewelry, family heirlooms. They should come with Sarah as part of her inheritance." "Of course," Samuel agreed, "but let me be clear about something else. If we proceed with this marriage, Miss Caldwell will be my partner, not my servant. This ranch needs a woman's guidance, yes, but it also needs someone who can think independently and make decisions. I'm not looking for a timid wife who will simply follow orders." Sarah found her voice at last. "And what if your wife had opinions that differed from yours? What if she wanted to make changes you didn't approve of?" Samuel's eyes met hers directly, and she saw both challenge and respect in their depths. Then we'd discuss it like reasonable adults. My parents had disagreements, but they always worked things out through conversation, not commands. I hope to have the same kind of partnership. The conversation was interrupted by Maria's return with a tray of coffee and what appeared to be fresh-baked cookies. As they settled into the ritual of refreshments, Sarah found herself stealing glances at Samuel, trying to reconcile the boy from her memories with the man sitting across from her. There were similarities, the same thoughtful way he considered his words, the same kindness in his eyes. But there were differences too. This man carried responsibilities her young friend never could have imagined. Perhaps, Samuel said after they had all been served, Miss Caldwell would like to see more of the ranch. It will be her home after all, assuming we can come to an agreement. Sarah nodded, grateful for the opportunity to escape the formal atmosphere of negotiation. As they rose to leave, her father caught her arm gently. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that Samuel couldn't hear. "If you're not comfortable with the arrangement, we can find another way to handle the debt." But even as he spoke the words, Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. There was no other way, and they both knew it. Still, the offer meant something, a recognition that she had choices even in this impossible situation. "I'll keep that in mind, Papa," she said, squeezing his hand. Outside, the afternoon sun had grown warm, and Sarah was grateful for the shade provided by her bonnet. Samuel led her through the various outbuildings, explaining the operations of the ranch with obvious pride and enthusiasm. He showed her the dairy barn, where several cows provided milk and cheese for both the ranch and the town, the chicken coops that supplied fresh eggs, and the vegetable garden that helped feed the small community of ranch hands and their families. "We're largely self-sufficient," he explained as they walked. "My father believed in taking care of our people, making sure everyone had what they needed. The men who work here aren't just employees, they're family." It was an admirable philosophy, and Sarah found herself impressed despite her reservations about the overall situation. This was clearly a man who took his responsibilities seriously, who understood that leadership meant service as much as authority. As they paused beside a corral where several horses grazed in the afternoon sunshine, Samuel turned to her with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of important words. "Miss Caldwell," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "Sarah, if I may, there's something I need to tell you, something that might change how you feel about this whole arrangement." Sarah's heart began to pound again, and she found herself both dreading and anticipating whatever revelation was coming. "What is it?" Samuel looked out over the pasture for a moment, as if gathering his courage. 15 years ago, I almost drowned in a river not far from here. A girl saved my life that day, pulled me out of the water when I couldn't save myself. I never learned her name, never saw her again, but I never forgot her either." Sarah felt the world tilt around her, and she gripped the fence rail for support. He did remember. After all these years, he remembered. "The thing is," Samuel continued, his voice soft but certain, "I believe that girl was you." The words hung between them like a bridge across 15 years of separation, and Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes despite her efforts to maintain composure. The boy she had saved, the boy whose grateful smile had sustained her through years of loneliness and loss, was standing before her as the man she was meant to marry. It seemed impossible, like something from one of the fairy tales her mother used to read to her before bedtime. "You remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. Samuel's face softened with something that looked like wonder mixed with long-held gratitude. "How could I forget? You risked your own life to save a stranger. When I woke up on that riverbank, coughing up water and shaking from cold and fear, you were the first thing I saw. An angel in a torn blue dress, your hair all wild from the wind and water, telling me everything would be all right." Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the memory of that day and the strange turn of fate that had brought them together again. "You were so scared," she said softly. "You kept saying you couldn't swim, that the current was too strong, but you fought so hard to stay above water." "I was terrified," Samuel admitted. "I'd never felt so helpless in my life. But then you were there, and somehow you managed to pull me to shore even though you were half my size. You probably saved my life that day. And now," Sarah said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze, "you're supposed to save mine." The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Life had come full circle in a way that seemed too poetic to be mere coincidence. Two children who had shared a moment of crisis and connection were being offered a chance to share a lifetime, brought together by circumstances that were both practical and somehow miraculous. "Sarah," Samuel said, stepping closer, "I want you to know that even if we'd never met before, even if you weren't the girl from the river, I would still want you to feel comfortable here. This arrangement doesn't have to be a prison sentence for either of us, but knowing who you are, knowing what you did for me." He paused, searching for words. "It feels like destiny." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching at a gallop, dust rising behind his horse in a great cloud. Samuel frowned, clearly recognizing something urgent in the rider's approach. "That's Tom Riley," he said. "He works for the Hendersons, our neighbors to the east. Something must be wrong." The man pulled up his horse near the corral, his face flushed with exertion and worry. "Mr. Blackwood, thank God you're here. There's been an accident at the Henderson place. Mrs. Henderson's gone into labor early and something's gone wrong. The midwife can't get there in time. There's a washout on the north road from yesterday's storm." Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathy and fear. Childbirth was dangerous enough under the best circumstances, but without proper help, both mother and baby could be lost. Samuel was already moving toward the barn. "I'll get my horse. Tom, ride ahead and tell them I'm coming. I'll bring what medical supplies we have." "Wait," Sarah called out, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Both men turned to look at her, and she felt a moment of uncertainty before her resolve strengthened. "I'm coming with you." Samuel's expression shifted to concern. "Sarah, that's very kind, but it's not necessary. This could be difficult to witness." "I've attended births before," Sarah said quietly. "My mother was a midwife before she married my father. She taught me what she could before she died. I might be able to help." The admission surprised even her. She hadn't spoken of her mother's skills in years, hadn't thought about the lessons learned at her bedside as they tended to women in their small community. But the knowledge was there, buried under years of grief and displacement, ready to be called upon when needed. Samuel studied her face, perhaps seeing something there that convinced him of her sincerity. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah said, though she privately wondered how she'd manage in her traveling dress. "I'll need a horse." "I'll get Belle," Samuel said. "She's gentle but fast." He turned to Tom. "Tell Mrs. Henderson we're coming. Tell her to hang on." As Tom galloped away, Samuel disappeared into the barn, emerging moments later with 2 saddled horses. Belle was indeed a beautiful animal, a chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Sarah gathered her skirts and accepted Samuel's help mounting, grateful for his steady hands and encouraging words. The ride to the Henderson place was a blur of pounding hooves and desperate urgency. Sarah clung to Belle's reins, her mind racing through everything her mother had taught her about difficult births. She thought of the herbs that could help slow bleeding, the positioning that might ease a breech presentation, the calm voice and steady hands that could sometimes make the difference between life and death. The Henderson farm was smaller than Samuel's ranch, but well maintained, with fields of corn stretching toward the horizon, and a modest white house surrounded by practical outbuildings. As they approached, they could hear the sounds of distress from inside, a woman's cries of pain and fear, voices raised in worry and confusion. Samuel and Sarah dismounted quickly, and he grabbed a leather satchel from his saddlebags before they hurried toward the house. Inside, they found chaos. Mrs. Henderson, a woman Sarah judged to be in her 30s, was lying on a bed in obvious distress, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. Her husband paced nearby, his hands shaking as he tried to comfort his other children, 2 young boys who watched with wide, frightened eyes. "Thank God you're here," Mr. Henderson said, relief evident in his voice. "She's been like this for hours. The baby won't come and she's bleeding." Sarah moved to the bedside, her training taking over despite her nervousness. She gently examined Mrs. Henderson, speaking softly to her as she worked. "My name is Sarah," she said. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me when the pain started?" Mrs. Henderson gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Before dawn," she gasped. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. This isn't like the others." Sarah's examination confirmed her fears. The baby was positioned incorrectly, and the prolonged labor had weakened both mother and child. But she had seen her mother handle similar situations, had watched and learned even when she was too young to fully understand what was happening. "Samuel," she said quietly, "I need hot water, clean cloths, and anything you have that might help with pain. Willow bark if you have it, or laudanum if there's any to be found." He nodded, and moved quickly to gather the supplies. Mr. Henderson hovered anxiously, and Sarah gently suggested he take his sons outside to wait. "Your wife needs quiet right now," she explained, "and this will be easier for her if she doesn't have to worry about the children seeing her in pain." For the next several hours, Sarah worked with a focus and determination she hadn't known she possessed. She remembered her mother's gentle voice explaining the delicate process of turning a breached baby, the careful pressure and patience required to coax new life safely into the world. Samuel assisted with quiet competence, anticipating her needs and providing steady support when the situation grew most critical. Mrs. Henderson fought bravely, following Sarah's instructions even when the pain seemed unbearable. "Almost there," Sarah encouraged, feeling the baby finally shift into the correct position. "One more push, just one more." The baby's cry filled the room like a benediction, strong and healthy despite the difficult entry into the world. Sarah cleaned the infant, a daughter, and wrapped her in soft cloths before placing her in her mother's arms. Mrs. Henderson wept with relief and joy, holding her daughter close as her husband rushed in to see his new child. "You saved them both," Samuel said quietly as they cleaned up the makeshift delivery room. "If you hadn't been here," Sarah shook her head, suddenly exhausted now that the crisis had passed. "We all did what was necessary. That's what people do for each other." But as they prepared to leave, accepting the Hendersons' tearful gratitude and promises of eternal friendship, Sarah realized something had changed within her. She had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a purpose that went beyond mere survival or obligation. For the first time since her mother's death, she had felt truly useful, truly needed. The ride back to Samuel's ranch was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the sun began to set behind the mountains. When they finally arrived, Sarah's father was waiting on the front porch, his face creased with worry. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I was beginning to think something had happened to you." Samuel quickly explained about the emergency, and Sarah found herself watching her father's face as he listened. She saw surprise there, and something that might have been pride as Samuel described her skill and composure during the difficult birth. "Well," Robert Caldwell said finally, looking at his daughter with new eyes, "it seems you have more of your mother in you than I realized." As they prepared for dinner, Sarah found herself thinking about the events of the day. She had begun the morning as a reluctant bride, bound by duty and desperation to a man she didn't know. But now, as evening shadows lengthened across the ranch, she felt something different stirring in her chest. Not love, perhaps, that would take time to grow, but respect, and possibility, and hope. 3 months had passed since that first day at the Blackwood Ranch, and Sarah barely recognized the woman she had become. The frightened, reluctant bride who had arrived with nothing but resentment and duty had transformed into someone confident, purposeful, and surprisingly happy. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward dinners where conversation felt forced, moments of uncertainty when she wondered if she was truly welcome, and nights when she lay awake missing the familiar sounds of her childhood home. But gradually, day by day, the ranch had become more than just shelter. It had become home. Samuel had been patient beyond measure, never pressing for more than friendship, never making her feel like an obligation to be fulfilled. Instead, he had shown her the workings of the ranch, taught her to read the weather patterns that predicted good days for haying or bad days for travel. He had listened to her stories about her mother's healing practices and encouraged her to establish a small herb garden behind the main house. Word of her skills had spread throughout the territory after the successful delivery at the Henderson place. Women began arriving at the ranch seeking her help with everything from difficult pregnancies to childhood fevers. Sarah found herself becoming the unofficial midwife and healer for the surrounding communities, a role that filled her with purpose and pride. "You've found your calling," Samuel told her one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "My mother would have loved you. She always said this place needed a woman's healing touch." Sarah smiled, thinking of the woman she had never met but whose presence she felt throughout the house, in the carefully preserved herb garden, in the medical supplies kept in pristine condition, in the way Samuel spoke of her with such obvious love and respect. "Tell me about her," Sarah said as she had many times before. She never tired of hearing Samuel's stories about his mother, partly because they helped her understand the man he had become, and partly because they gave her a vision of what her own life might become. "She was like you," Samuel said simply. "Brave, determined, willing to help anyone who needed it, She delivered half the babies in this territory and saved more lives than the circuit doctor ever did. She would have been proud to see you carrying on her work." Their relationship had deepened slowly, built on shared experiences and mutual respect, rather than passion or desperate need. Sarah had learned to appreciate Samuel's quiet strength, his fundamental decency, and his ability to see the best in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. He had learned to value her intelligence, her independence, and her fierce dedication to helping others. The moment when friendship began to transform into something deeper had come unexpectedly. They had been working together to deliver a full, both covered in hay and exhaustion, when Sarah had looked up to find Samuel watching her with an expression of such tenderness that her breath caught in her throat. "What?" she had asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking," he had said softly, "about that scared little boy who fell in the river 15 years ago. He never could have imagined that someday he'd be lucky enough to call his rescuer his wife." The word wife had hung between them, no longer a burden or a legal arrangement, but something precious and chosen. That night, for the first time since their wedding ceremony 3 months earlier, Sarah had not gone to sleep in the guest room, but had joined Samuel in the master bedroom, ready to make their marriage real in every sense. Now, as autumn painted the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. Her father's debt had been repaid not just in financial terms but in ways none of them could have anticipated. Robert Caldwell had found peace working the land again, his skills valued, and his past mistakes forgiven. Samuel had gained not just a wife, but a partner who shared his vision for the ranch and his commitment to serving their community. And Sarah herself had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful destinations were reached by paths you never would have chosen. The arranged marriage that had seemed like the end of her dreams had actually been the beginning of a life richer and more meaningful than anything she had ever imagined. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he posed sometimes when the day's work was done and they had time to reflect on the turns their lives had taken. Sarah considered the question seriously, as she always did. She thought about the girl she had been, angry and resentful about her lack of choices. She thought about the woman she had become, confident in her abilities and secure in her place in the world. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that it took 15 years for that boy by the river to find his way back to me." Samuel lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Maybe we both needed those 15 years to become the people we were meant to be," he said. "Maybe we needed to learn how to save ourselves before we could save each other." Sarah smiled, thinking of the truth in his words. They had both been shaped by loss and hardship, by the necessities of frontier life and the responsibilities that came with adulthood. But those experiences had also given them the strength and wisdom to build something lasting together. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a wild, lonesome sound that spoke of the vast wilderness surrounding their small haven of civilization. But Sarah felt no loneliness, only gratitude for the unexpected gifts that life had brought her. Love grown from friendship, purpose found in service, and a future bright with possibility. The end.